Welcome. Today we're going to be discussing inclusion. What is it and why is it so important? Our session objectives are to review the history of educational inclusion in the United States, to discuss research supporting educational inclusion and success stories, and to understand the components of high-quality inclusive education and what to look for in your child's educational program. So to begin with, what is inclusion? As an overall definition, this is the Oxford Dictionary definition. The practice of being included within a group or a structure, often referred to the practice or policy of providing equal access to opportunities and resources for people who might otherwise be excluded or marginalized, such as those who have physical or intellectual disabilities and members of other minority groups. So how does it apply to education? So back in 1975, President Ford signed into law the Education of All Handicapped Children Act, which was known as the Public Law 94-142, and it's now known as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. You'll also hear this referred to as IDEA or IDEA, and it has been reauthorized a number of times. The law states that every child is entitled to what's called the least restrictive environment, and you'll often hear that referred to as LRE, which means that students with an identified disability must be educated with their peers in general education to the maximum extent appropriate. The challenge that we get into in terms of applying this federal law within our local educational systems is, what is the maximum extent appropriate? People have different opinions about that, but the federal law clearly guides that we should be making that effort to include students and have them being educated with their general education peers. In 2022 to 23, more than 66% of children with disabilities are in general education classrooms 80% or more of their school day. So it's really important to kind of keep this federal law in view when we're advocating for our children and when we're looking at local policy about how we apply this law. Here is a screenshot of the Individuals with Disabilities Act page on LRE, and this will be linked in the back of the presentation. Again, least restrictive environment. We're going to look at the second part of this, to the maximum extent appropriate. Children with disabilities, including children in public or private institutions or other care facilities, are educated with children who are non-disabled. And then looking at special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of children with disabilities from regular education environment occurs only if the nature or severity of the disability is such that inclusion in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. So what this really guides us is that we have to include children with special education needs in general education settings and really try to make those supports available before we say they cannot be successful here, before we say that they need an entirely separate class or separate schooling. So reflecting on some of the research of the benefits and the effectiveness, particularly now we're looking at preschool inclusion in that early childhood stage. We know that children with disabilities in inclusive classrooms are more likely to engage in peer interactions compared to children with disabilities in segregated settings. So they already at a very early age start to engage more, and they're learning some of those social cues and social skills from children who may not have delays. And that's one of the most prominent benefits of the inclusion, is that they have models of children with different skill sets. Both children with disabilities and typically developing children who attended an inclusive, high-quality pre-kindergarten program made significant gains in early literacy scores. Children with disabilities made similar gains in print awareness and oral language as their typically developing peers. And typically developing children in inclusive settings have more positive attitudes towards children with disabilities compared to children who did not encounter peers with disabilities. And this is just a sample, and again, the link will be in the end of the presentation. But it really illustrates that there's many benefits to it that have been proven through the research, which has looked at larger amounts of children with disabilities and how they're included in different kinds of settings, and what has really been proven to be some of the benefits. And we also know that the earlier we do inclusion, the more these benefits are seen. So when we talk about early literacy scores, we don't get that time back. We know that if children are reading below grade level, even into primary grades, they are already set up to kind of remain below grade level. Whereas if they're catching up early on, we have a much better trajectory of their education in general. And the same with those attitudes towards children and that understanding. When children are very young, before 5, they have more flexibility of thinking. They have more openness. They're not necessarily focused in on the differences yet. And so that is the best time to include them and to really get them acclimated to different kinds of learners and different kinds of individuals. So I wanted to show a brief video. This is just about 3 minutes long. It's a fabulous video that really demonstrates, again, the benefits of inclusion, and it highlights a young lady named Thassa. It is from a school district in the New England part of our country, which is known to be very inclusive. And it really shows the benefits of some of what we just went through from a research perspective, but from an individual child and an individual perspective.
I was happy to know that my kid, Tasha, will be in the same class as everyone else, because I thought it would give her the opportunity to look at other kids who are normal and do what they usually do. Instead of being in a classroom with just more kids with autism, then I would feel that she wouldn't really learn anything new.
If she wasn't in the classroom, she wouldn't be able to see what the other kids were doing to pick it up. She's very observant of what the other kids are doing. Some of the kids that she is in the classroom with now have been with her for a year or two, or have been with other students with different disabilities. So they're very open to helping out, and they're aware that they're modeling also.
Guys, we have to touch her. No, don't touch her, Bree. I'm not touching her. She's touching me, Edward. No.
My philosophy is that social growth and learning how to engage with everyone in the world is just as important as learning your academics. And I have just felt that the kids have so many rewarding experiences just learning to accept and to understand and to support people that are different.
Let's rotate paper.
We want her to be Tasha, and if Tasha is going to do her work at her desk or at a table or under the table or wherever, that's fine.
If you're not willing to differentiate your instruction for the wide range of learners that you have, including students with autism, then you're not in the right profession.
We're in front. Excuse us.
Yeah, she makes me a much better teacher. Patience is a virtue.
Where are you going? The piano, right here.
Everyone has strengths and weaknesses, and very often we learned things from Tasha that we wouldn't have learned had she not been in here. She amazed the class all the time.
Just want to let you know that we've never actually done this before, so we're kind of figuring it out as we go along. This is also a concert for to hear some special piano playing. So you're going to hear some solos on the piano. And she's playing one of our flutophone songs now.
And now we want to look at some of the components of high quality, inclusive early childhood programs. Again, we know that there's a federal law that's guiding that we should do it. The question becomes, how do we do it? What does it look like? So these are some of the broader components, and then we're going to break it down in terms of what does it look like in the classrooms. But the first is to include children with disabilities in early childhood programs. So that's kind of our overarching goal. Provide high quality teaching and learning environments that allow all children to meet high expectations. So just including children in the programs is not going to be as beneficial if we're not expecting all children to learn. Now, granted, they might need some different supports, they might learn at their own pace, but the expectation is still that they will learn, and we'll create environments where all children can access the content and access the peers and access the learning in that environment. Another component is that it intentionally promotes children's participation in all learning and social activities. So again, not just having children present in the room, but their active participation. If there's a group story time, if there's a group activity, that all children are expected and able to participate in that. It uses high quality evidence-based services and supports that are developmentally appropriate, culturally and linguistically responsive. So now we're starting to get into the specifics of what are those differences. We have a class of different kinds of learners, and what are some of those differences, and how do we create supports that all of them are invited into that learning environment, that they are all giving a means to understand what's happening, to respond to what's happening, right? Because ultimately learning is a reciprocal process. Right? The teacher seemingly has more of that information that we're trying to deliver, but we also need to check that the children are understanding. So if the children don't have a way to respond or to answer or to ask questions, then we don't know that learning is really taking place. So how do we create those services and supports that really engage all the learners? And another component is it provides services and supports to children within daily routines, learning, and social activities. So again, now those supports are going beyond the actual content, right, what we consider to be the learning, the literacy and the math, but into daily routines, mealtime and self-care and playtime. So those supports are really throughout those children's days, because that is really how the learning is getting some traction, how they're getting into each different part of the day is fully included. And then it's going to, very importantly, recognize families as collaborative partners, experts, and engaged decision makers in their children's lives. And although this is one out of all the points, it's a very critical one. In all of my years in working in inclusive settings, this has been maybe the most pivotal. If we welcome families into the process and understand how they include their own children and how they wish for their child to be included, and how they're willing to kind of problem solve and be thought partners with us about what would help their child and how we can work together, it really creates a whole different energy and a whole different positivity in terms of how effective that early childhood environment can be. So now we're going to just do a few slides to kind of examine what does it look like. So when we think about environment, engagement, and inclusion, what does it look like when we're including children with disabilities into a classroom of children without disabilities? So the first one is that the classroom is divided into well-defined areas. And so if we have a large classroom, that there's some visual breakup where the children can see this is the art area or this is the play area. Adequate workspace for individual students and large and small groups of students. So we're breaking up into maybe kinds of learning formats that work for children, different pacing. So some children might be moving through an activity quicker than others, but we're going to have some of that flexibility of grouping and space within the room so that everybody can get what they need. There's a wide variety of real and representational materials reflecting students' interests, learning levels, and cultures. The materials on the shelves are labeled and they can be accessed by students. So one of the ways that children can start to learn how to be responsible in the learning environment is that they know where to put things and they know where to get things from. Classroom routines are followed with what we call universally designed labels and signals with differentiated support. So what this might mean is there might be pictures of toys in addition to the word. There might be colors. There might be stop signs. There might be some of that universal with a red circle and a line through it. So if a center is closed, there's a visual support to show a child that it's closed, it's not available right now. We're thinking of different ways to really communicate information. Throughout the daily routine, there's a balance of large and small group and individual instruction, as well as active outdoor and reflective indoor activities. So again, we're being sensitive to children are going to have different energy levels, different preferences. But if we create a daily routine where everybody's getting what they need, then there's going to be more rhythm. There's going to be more balance and more joy that the children are really benefiting from what's being offered. All students receive instruction with their peers according to their individual strengths and needs based on the least restrictive curriculum and environment. So again, we're acknowledging that there's maybe content goals for all children, and then we're figuring out how our children, some children are going to be stronger in some areas than others, some children are going to need more support in others, but we're going to provide access to all. And general education and special education service providers collaboratively plan the implementation of services within the least restrictive environment based on individual student strengths and needs. And this is really where that can be felt in an environment where that general education and special education service providers and teachers are really thinking kind of from slightly different lens. Same in terms of we're here to educate all students and we have a good grasp on what's developmentally appropriate for the age of children that we're serving. So if we're serving, let's say, a pre-K4 class, but then they're going to have slightly different lenses in terms of, well, here's how we would offer this lesson to all children. And then here's how we would maybe make some adjustments for children with some diverse learning needs. But there really is that collaboration. And the more ideas that come together, the more that's able to be created and the more that you're able to reach more children in the environment. So now to look at communication and technology support. All students have access to communication systems and supports according to their strengths and needs. So again, that thinking of learning being reciprocal, and students are not just receivers of information, but also have a voice as to whether they understood that, whether they have questions about it, whether they relate to it. That's really where learning takes place. And if children don't have communication systems to be able to share that voice, then that can be challenging. One, we don't know what children are learning, but also it can become very frustrating for children if they don't have a communication system where they're able to ask for clarity or make comments. We all want a voice. And so it's a very critical piece that's in place for children. The next is there's a weekly schedule that designates both staff and student locations, and activities are visible and consistently followed. So again, any kind of routines are going to help with that predictability. And we know that if children don't know what's coming up next and they don't have a communication system to ask, right, ideally we'd have children raising their hand and say, excuse me, teacher, what are we doing next? And that's not always the reality. And if we don't have a way to be able to ask that or visually reference a schedule and see when snack is coming or when recess is coming, we might ask that through our behavior, because generally all behavior is communication. And so if we see children grabbing their coats and running to the door, they might be asking, I want to go outside, or when is it recess time? But if all of that is on a weekly schedule where they can see and it's followed consistently, then you might not get as many children asking through their behavior. Students are observed using visibly based work systems, which are both individualized per student learning characteristics, moving left to right, top to bottom. So this is really for some students that might need some individual kind of structuring of specific activities. You'd have a daily schedule for the whole class, and then there might be children that need some more specifics in terms of a certain work period or learning block, what kinds of activities they would be doing. Students are observed using their individual work system that visibly tells them their work, how much to do, when they're finished, what to do next. Again, using visuals for all of that is just providing more information. And when we have the information we need, we're generally more engaged, we're generally more relaxed, and we're more present The students are observed using those individual schedules and work systems in other settings outside of the classroom. So it might be if those children transition to related arts, an art class or a music class, that they have a similar schedule that follows them. And hopefully the classrooms are following some similar routines. We know that teacher style and different classrooms might have different organizations. So we might not all sit on the floor, we might not all sit at the same tables, but there might be some greeting of children, some welcoming, then some activity. For early childhood, we're looking at then some movement, then maybe back to another activity, so that it's looking similar in different environments within that educational setting. And then communication systems are used by students throughout their daily routine that support engagement, choice, and language with peers and adults. So again, kind of going back to that initial point of they need to have communication systems where they have a voice and they're able to communicate, or else the frustration that can come out of that can be very, very challenging. And that is often why systems then fade away from including children with learning differences or particular communication differences, not because they don't belong in the environment, but because there wasn't an adequate communication system for them to access the environment. So then we want to look at the communication system and adjust that as opposed to the presence of the child in the room or in the environment. And then the last is just touching on behavioral support and social skills. And I will share that each of these, again, you'll see the link for it in the next slide, an article that goes much more in depth to this. And there's many, many more research and guidance around it. This is just meant to be an overview in 3 of the broad areas when we think about inclusion, particularly inclusion for early childhood. So when we think about behavioral support and social skills, we're looking at those environmental accommodations that prevent or minimize problematic behavioral patterns that are observed. And some examples, some boundary markers, some visual schedules, labeling, choice or communication boards, transition activity, completion signals. This could be as simple as the line next to the door, or I've seen little cutouts of footprints, right, to help children understand where to stand. Timers or music that plays when one activity is ending and another one is starting. So when we talk about environmental accommodations, our job is really, how do we support this environment? How do we create the environment to inform all of the learners and adults in the room, instead of trying to make it so that not everybody is clear. We want to make it crystal clear what's expected and what's going to happen next. The second is that all team members contribute to functional behavior assessments guided by trained professionals that results in holistic interventions used to decrease challenging behavior patterns and increase pro-social learning behaviors. Functional behavior assessments are under a long line of behavioral psychology, and the goal is it's a scientific look, analysis of behavior. So when we look at how a student is demonstrating a behavior, and in this case we're talking about a challenging behavior that might not be serving them. In other words, it's either disconnecting them from the environment or from the learning. It's not helping them build relationships either with peers or with their teachers. And so we need more information. We need to say, well, what is it that's happening before this behavior and what's happening after that's really encouraging the child to kind of act this way? Or maybe another way to think of it is it's not giving them the alternatives. What should they be doing instead? So it's really important that if we're looking at that as a team, there's a trained professional that really knows the science of those FBAs to really help guide it. And then we're looking at not only decreasing what we don't want to see, but increasing what we do want to see. So if a child, for example, is throwing toys instead of cleaning them up, the goal is, how do we clean them up appropriately? And if we just focus on getting them to stop throwing, we're not going to see much else. So that's a really important piece, but very critical as to how students are productively included. The next is that all service providers implement the least intrusive positive behavior supports to decrease the target behavior and increase the replacement behavior. Similar to the one previous, again, we want to decrease something that we don't want to see, that's not helping them meet their goal, or it's not helping them really learn the skill of the environment, whether it be communication or social or even the content, but increase what we call replacement behavior. So what should they be doing instead, right? What is another way to, let's say, ask for the toy instead of taking it from a peer? And if we're not looking at both of those at the same time, we often don't make progress. We tend to kind of keep wanting to decrease what we don't want to see, but we don't have enough tools to help increase what we do want to see. And that's really where the learning happens. That's where we all learn and get our skill set. I always used to say, if we start a new job and we get a manual of our job description, it doesn't have a list of things not to do, right? It has a list of things of what we should do. And that's really how we want to approach children, especially children that might not be performing behaviorally the way we're hoping they would in that environment. We really want to teach more about what they should be doing and give them the tools to learn it, to understand it, and to communicate around it instead of saying what not to do. Because that's not the way any of us learn. And ultimately, there are people just like the rest of us, just smaller and with less experience, but they still have that same framework. They still have those same needs in terms of having information, feeling that sense of belonging, having relationships. And if we think of them that way, then we tend to kind of wrap around those supports that they really need to be successful. And the last one under behavioral support and social skills is instruction is observed to support student acquisition of social skills as students use these skills with adults and peers for a range of occasions and environments. So again, when they're given that opportunity, they're actually engaging, they're interacting with others, not only their teachers and adults in the room, but peers, and everybody is learning. Everybody in the environment is learning something and really benefiting from being in the environment together. So here are the list of references. Again, the first one is that link to our federal law on the Individuals with Disabilities Act. A couple different pages there, one on the history and one on the specific regulations around least restrictive environment, and then some of the other articles where the content was taken from today. So we hope you've enjoyed it. We hope that it's add some context to what we keep hearing as inclusion or inclusive education, and feel free to reach out to us at the Birth Through 5 office of Anne Arundel County Public Schools if you have any further questions. Take care.